There is a certain kind of person who can spend hours alone without feeling like something is missing. They don't necessarily hate people, they don't avoid relationships. They can laugh, talk, socialize, and participate in the world just like everyone else. But somewhere beneath all of that, there is a quiet part of them that does not depend on being surrounded, and sometimes they don't even realize how different this makes them. They simply assume that the way they live is normal. They assume everyone enjoys silence the way they do. Everyone needs the same amount of distance. Everyone thinks independently, and everyone can walk away from a crowd without feeling lost. But that isn't always true. There are people who need constant interaction to feel grounded, people who unconsciously measure themselves through attention, approval, and belonging. And then there are those who gradually develop something different. Not necessarily isolation, not necessarily loneliness, something closer to psychological independence. They can be around people without needing to become them. They can be alone without immediately trying to escape themselves. And the strange part is that this often develops quietly. There is no moment when you suddenly decide, I am a lone wolf. Instead, you notice small patterns in the way you think, the way you choose relationships, the way you respond to pressure, and the way you behave when nobody is watching. And if you have ever wondered why you seem comfortable walking a different path, even when everyone else is moving in another direction, there may be a reason. You may have developed a level of inner independence that you have never consciously recognized. So let's look at 5 signs that you might be a lone wolf without even knowing it. The first sign is that you genuinely enjoy your own company, not because you have given up on people, and not because you believe you are better than everyone else, but because being alone does not automatically feel empty. There is an important distinction here. Many people are alone but constantly searching for something to fill the silence. They open their phone, scroll through social media, message someone, turn on a video, or look for some kind of stimulation because the moment everything becomes quiet, their own thoughts become difficult to avoid. Solitude can expose things that noise allows us to ignore. But if you can sit alone for a while and simply exist without needing constant stimulation, that says something about your relationship with yourself. Maybe you enjoy walking alone. Maybe you like working on something without anyone interrupting you. Maybe you can spend an entire evening thinking, reading, creating, planning, or simply sitting quietly and not feel that you need someone to rescue you from the silence. You may even look forward to those moments. And this does not mean you don't care about other people. It means your sense of stability isn't completely dependent on their presence. Carl Jung's idea of individuation points towards something similar. The process of becoming more fully yourself requires periods in which you are not simply reacting to the expectations of the collective. You need space to hear your own thoughts beneath all the voices around you. The person who is comfortable alone has an opportunity that many people avoid. They can actually observe themselves. They can notice what they believe when nobody is telling them what to believe. They can recognize what they want when nobody is watching. And over time, that creates something subtle. You become less afraid of silence. You stop treating being alone as evidence that something is wrong with you. You begin to understand that solitude can be a place where your mind becomes clearer. And perhaps you've noticed this about yourself. After spending time around people, you don't necessarily want more people. Sometimes you want to go home, you want the door closed. You want your phone somewhere far away. You want a few hours where nobody needs anything from you. Not because you're angry, not because someone offended you. You simply need to return to yourself. And if that sounds familiar, it may be the first sign. The second sign is that you don't follow the crowd easily, even when following it would make your life simpler. This is one of the quieter signs, because from the outside, you may not look rebellious at all. You may actually be calm, polite, and respectful, but internally you have a difficult relationship with blind conformity. When everyone suddenly likes something, you don't automatically like it. When everyone hates something, you don't automatically hate it. When everyone tells you that a certain path is the only path, something inside you wants to examine it for yourself. You don't necessarily reject what other people believe. You simply don't want to borrow their beliefs without thinking. And that difference matters. There is a psychological comfort in belonging to a group. When everyone around you agrees, you don't have to carry the burden of questioning. You don't have to wonder whether you're wrong because everyone seems to be moving in the same direction. But the person who thinks independently eventually realizes that popularity and truth are not the same thing. Sometimes the crowd is right. Sometimes the crowd is wrong. The point is that you want to decide for yourself. This can create a strange experience. People may occasionally misunderstand you because they expect agreement where you're offering examination. They may say you're overthinking, They may ask why you can't just go along with everyone else. And sometimes you probably do wonder the same thing. Why can't you simply accept things the way they are? The answer may be that your mind needs internal agreement before it can offer external agreement. You need to understand something before you can genuinely accept it. This is not always convenient. It can make decisions slower. It can make you question things that other people never question. But it also means that when you finally make a decision, it tends to feel more like yours. You're not simply repeating a direction you inherited. You're choosing it. And this is another aspect of walking alone. It doesn't always mean physically walking away from people. Sometimes it means remaining in the same room while refusing to surrender your own judgment. The third sign is that you are selective about who gets access to you. You may know many people, but very few people actually know you. There is a difference between being socially connected and being emotionally open. You can have hundreds of contacts and still only trust a handful of people. You may be friendly with almost everyone, but deeply comfortable with only a few. And perhaps you've noticed that you don't reveal everything about yourself immediately. You observe first. You listen. You watch how someone treats other people. You notice whether their words match their behavior. You pay attention to how they respond when you disagree with them. You notice whether they respect boundaries or constantly test them. This doesn't necessarily come from suspicion. It can simply come from understanding that closeness has value and should not be given automatically. A lone wolf mentality, when healthy, is not about building walls around yourself. It's about having a door and deciding who you open it for. There is a difference. Some people feel uncomfortable unless everyone likes them. They keep relationships alive simply because ending them would make them feel guilty or afraid. But someone who has become comfortable with solitude is less likely to tolerate a connection purely because they fear being alone. They can walk away when a relationship repeatedly violates their values. They can accept that not every friendship is meant to last forever. They can understand that distance is sometimes healthier than forced closeness, and this can look cold from the outside. Someone might say, "You changed," and perhaps you did, but change is not always betrayal. Sometimes it is simply recognition. You begin to recognize what drains you. You begin to recognize what brings peace. You begin to recognize which conversations leave you feeling more like yourself, and which ones require you to perform a version of yourself that no longer feels authentic. This is where your relationships can become fewer but deeper. You don't need to speak to everyone every day. You don't need constant updates. You don't need to prove that a friendship exists by displaying it publicly. A quiet connection can be enough. A person who understands your silence can sometimes feel closer than 10 people who constantly demand your attention. And if you've reached a point where you would rather have a few genuine relationships than dozens of superficial ones, you may already be living this way without realizing it. The fourth sign is that you don't need constant validation to make a decision. This may be one of the strongest signs, because external approval is one of the easiest things to become dependent on. Think about how often people ask others what they should do. What should I wear? Should I take this job? Should I leave this relationship? Should I start this project? Should I say this? Should I choose that? Asking for advice isn't weakness. In many situations, it is wise. Other people can see things we cannot see. But there is a difference between seeking perspective and surrendering responsibility. A psychologically independent person can listen to advice without becoming controlled by it. They can hear 10 opinions and still return to their own judgment. They understand that other people can advise them, but they cannot live the consequences for them. And that creates a different relationship with decision-making. You may still doubt yourself. You may still become uncertain. You may still make mistakes. Being a lone wolf does not mean possessing perfect confidence. It means being willing to carry the responsibility of your own choices. You don't need everyone to agree before you move. You don't need applause before you begin. You don't need someone to tell you that your path is valid every morning. Sometimes you simply decide that something matters to you and you continue. This is especially difficult when your decision makes little sense to the people around you. Maybe you choose a career they don't understand. Maybe you stop doing something everyone else enjoys. Maybe you spend years building something while other people are chasing immediate comfort. Maybe you simply prefer a quieter life than the one everyone tells you that you should want. There will always be someone who doesn't understand. But the moment you realize that being misunderstood is not the same as being wrong, you become much harder to control through approval. You stop changing your direction every time someone disagrees with you. And that does not mean becoming stubborn. In fact, real independence requires the ability to change your mind when evidence demands it. The difference is that you change because you have thought deeply about something, not because someone pressured you into it. Your decisions become internal rather than reactive, and that is a very quiet form of strength. The fifth sign is perhaps the most important. You can walk away from something familiar when you know it no longer fits who you are becoming. This is where many people struggle. Familiarity has a strange psychological power. Even when something is unhealthy, predictable discomfort can feel safer than uncertain freedom. A person may remain in the same environment for years simply because they know how to survive there. They may stay around the same people, repeat the same habits, follow the same routines, and continue living the same version of themselves, because changing it would require entering unfamiliar territory. The lone individual eventually learns something uncomfortable. Familiar does not always mean right, and uncomfortable does not always mean wrong. Sometimes growth begins precisely where familiarity ends. You may reach a point where an old environment no longer reflects your values. Conversations that once entertained you now feel empty. Habits that once felt normal now feel like something you're trying to outgrow. You begin to realize that the person you were when you entered that environment is not necessarily the person you are now. And when that happens, you may create distance, not dramatically, not with anger, not by announcing to everyone that you've changed. You simply begin moving differently. You spend less time in places that no longer fit. You stop explaining every decision. You stop trying to convince people who have already decided who you are. And sometimes, people will interpret this as rejection. They may think you're becoming distant or arrogant. But sometimes distance is not about thinking you're better than someone. It's about realizing that continuing the same pattern would require you to become smaller than yourself. Jung's concept of individuation is useful here because becoming yourself often involves separating psychologically from expectations that were absorbed long before you consciously chose them. Family expectations, social expectations, cultural expectations, the idea of what success should look like, the idea of how you should behave, the idea of who you should become. None of these things are automatically wrong, but they deserve examination, because there is a difference between choosing a life and inheriting one without questioning it. And sometimes the most difficult step is admitting that the life you have been building may not actually be yours. That doesn't mean destroying everything overnight. It means becoming honest enough to ask whether your current direction reflects your values. And if it doesn't, you begin changing it one decision at a time. But there is another layer to all of this, and it is important because the idea of being a lone wolf can easily be misunderstood. Walking alone does not mean refusing help. It does not mean believing you need nobody. It does not mean becoming emotionally unavailable, suspicious of everyone, or proud of your isolation. Those things can sometimes be defenses rather than strength. Real independence is not the inability to need anyone. It is the ability to remain yourself, even when you do need someone. There is a profound difference between saying, "I don't need anybody," and saying, "I can be okay with myself, and I still value people." The first can sometimes come from fear. The second comes from stability. Healthy solitude doesn't make you hate connection. It makes you more intentional about it. You begin to understand that relationships should not be used as medication for an identity you haven't built. Another person cannot permanently solve your emptiness. Attention cannot permanently stabilize insecurity. Constant companionship cannot permanently protect you from yourself. At some point, you have to become capable of sitting with your own mind. And once you can do that, connection becomes different. You don't enter a relationship simply because you're afraid of being alone. You enter because you genuinely value the person. You don't stay in a friendship because you're terrified of having fewer friends. You stay because there is mutual respect. You don't follow the group because you are afraid of standing apart. You participate when the group aligns with your values and step back when it doesn't. And perhaps this is why some people become quieter as they become more self-aware. Not because they have less to say, but because they no longer feel compelled to say everything. They don't need to explain every decision. They don't need to broadcast every achievement. They don't need to turn every internal realization into a public announcement. Their life becomes less performative. There is something psychologically freeing about no longer needing everyone to understand you. Think about how much energy is spent trying to control other people's perceptions. You explain yourself, you defend yourself, you prove your intentions. You try to make someone understand why you made a particular choice. But eventually, you realize that some people will interpret you through their own experiences regardless of what you say. You can explain yourself perfectly and still be misunderstood. And once you accept that, you stop making understanding a requirement for peace. You can say what needs to be said and then let people decide what they want to believe. This is not indifference, it is boundaries. You are responsible for your actions, not for every interpretation of them. There is also a certain kind of strength that develops when you spend enough time alone with your own decisions. You begin to learn the difference between impulse and intuition. You begin to recognize when fear is speaking and when genuine caution is speaking. You become more familiar with your own patterns. You notice when you are avoiding something because it is difficult, and when you are rejecting something because it genuinely does not fit you. This kind of self-awareness doesn't arrive through motivational quotes. It develops through experience, through making decisions, through making mistakes, through sitting quietly afterward and asking yourself what happened. That is why the lone path can be valuable. It creates room for observation, and observation creates understanding. You begin to see that you don't have to react to every emotion. You don't have to answer every provocation. You don't have to attend every gathering. You don't have to maintain every relationship. You don't have to chase every opportunity. You don't have to prove every point. There is a freedom in realizing that you are allowed to choose what deserves your energy. But there will still be difficult moments. Even someone who loves solitude can experience loneliness. Even someone who values independence can want companionship. Even someone who thinks independently can doubt themselves. These contradictions do not make the idea meaningless. They make it human. The goal isn't to become completely detached from everyone. The goal is to become capable of connection without losing yourself inside it. To be able to stand alone and still walk beside others when the path makes sense. To know when to speak and when to remain silent. To know when to stay and when to leave. To know when advice is valuable and when it is simply pressure disguised as concern. And perhaps most importantly, to know the difference between solitude that strengthens you and isolation that slowly closes you off from life. If being alone helps you understand yourself, build something meaningful, recover your balance, or think clearly, it can be valuable. But if you are using isolation to avoid every difficult relationship, every vulnerability, or every uncomfortable truth, then the silence may not be freedom. It may be avoidance. And that distinction matters. So if you recognized yourself in these 5 signs, don't rush to label yourself. You don't need to call yourself a lone wolf. The label isn't important. What matters is what you discovered about the way you move through the world. Maybe you enjoy your own company. Maybe you question the crowd. Maybe you are selective about who gets close. Maybe you can make decisions without constant approval. Maybe you are willing to leave familiar places when they no longer reflect who you are becoming. None of these things automatically make you stronger than anyone else. They simply suggest that you may have developed a different relationship with independence. And the real question isn't whether you walk alone. The real question is whether you know why you're walking. Because there is a difference between running away from people and moving toward yourself. One is driven by fear. The other can be driven by awareness. There is a difference between refusing connection and choosing connection carefully. There is a difference between being misunderstood and being incapable of communicating. There is a difference between solitude and loneliness. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this: you don't need to belong everywhere to belong to yourself. The person who learns this doesn't become disconnected from the world. They simply stop allowing the world to determine their entire identity. They can enter a room without needing to dominate it. They can leave a room without wondering whether everyone noticed. They can listen without needing to agree. They can disagree without needing to fight. They can love without possessing. They can be alone without feeling abandoned. And when they finally find people who genuinely understand them, they don't hold on to those relationships out of desperation. They appreciate them because they are chosen freely. That is the difference between dependence and connection. One says, "I need you so I can feel complete." The other says, "I am becoming whole, and I want to share this life with you." Maybe that's what the lone wolf was always meant to represent. Not a creature that hates the pack, not a symbol of superiority, not someone who believes they are above everyone else, but a person who has learned to hear their own instincts beneath the noise of the crowd. Someone who can step away long enough to ask, what do I actually believe? What do I actually want? What kind of person am I becoming? And those questions are uncomfortable because honest answers can change your life. They can change your relationships. They can change your priorities. They can change the direction you've been walking for years. But sometimes that discomfort is the beginning of something more authentic. Because eventually, the goal is not to walk alone forever. The goal is to become someone who does not lose themselves when they walk with others. Someone who can stand alone when necessary, connect when meaningful, leave when necessary, stay when it matters, and make decisions without constantly waiting for permission. Someone who understands that being alone for a season is not the same as being abandoned. Sometimes it is simply the space where you hear yourself clearly enough to decide where you want to go next. And if that sounds like you, perhaps you've already been walking this path without having a name for it. Maybe you've spent years wondering why you need more solitude than other people, why you don't feel comfortable following every trend, why you prefer a few deep connections over many shallow ones, why you can walk away from familiar situations when something inside you tells you it's time. Maybe there was never anything wrong with you. Maybe you were simply learning how to stand on your own feet. But remember, independence should never become an excuse to close your heart. Strength isn't proven by how many people you can live without. It is revealed by how well you can remain yourself while still being capable of loving, trusting, learning, and connecting with others. The strongest person isn't necessarily the one who walks alone. It may be the one who can walk alone without becoming bitter, and walk with others without becoming lost. If this message made you look at yourself a little differently, take a moment and ask yourself which of these 5 signs you recognized most strongly. Maybe it was your comfort with solitude, maybe your resistance to following the crowd, maybe your selective relationships, maybe your independence from validation, or maybe your willingness to leave behind what no longer fits. Whatever it is, don't turn it into an identity you have to perform. Just understand it, because self-awareness is more valuable than a label. And if you found something meaningful in this video, like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more deep psychological insights, philosophy, and ideas about understanding yourself and the world around you. Sometimes one idea is enough to make you question the life you've been living, and sometimes that question is where the real journey begins.